Let me tell you something that the headlines won't say clearly enough. Right now, in the spring of 2026, a war that many believe Russia would slowly, inevitably win is changing direction. Not because of luck, not because of politics, but because of something far more fundamental: discipline, adaptation, and the refusal to quit. I've spent decades studying conflict. I've planned missions where the margin between success and catastrophe was measured in seconds. And I can tell you, what is unfolding in Ukraine right now carries every signature of a turning tide. Not a victory, not yet, but a shift. And shifts, when they happen in warfare, are everything. Here is what you are about to understand. You are going to learn why Russia's 2026 offensive has stalled, not because of one single failure, but because of a cascade of compounding breakdowns in technology, in manpower, in economics, and in will. You are going to understand how Ukraine rebuilt its battlefield dominance through innovation, decentralization, and sheer operational ingenuity. And you are going to see why the drone war, the war most people still don't fully grasp, has become the defining contest of this conflict. Stay with me through every word of this, because the most important insight doesn't come at the beginning. It comes when all the pieces finally click together. And when they do, you will see this war and the nature of modern warfare itself in a way you never have before. Let's begin where all serious military analysis must begin: on the ground, with the facts as they actually are, stripped of propaganda from either side. As we enter May of 2026, Russia has not achieved a single one of its stated operational objectives for the year. Think about what that means. The Russian military machine, the largest land army in Europe, backed by one of the world's largest defense budgets, fighting a nation a fraction of its size, has spent 4 months of its offensive campaign and has virtually nothing to show for it in terms of territorial gain. Their presumed objectives coming into 2026 were clear: capture Zaporizhia, push through Orikhiv, take Kostiantynivka, drive towards Sloviansk, seize Liman, and threaten Kupiansk. These are not small ambitions. They represent the strategic spine of eastern Ukraine. And yet 1/3 of the year has passed, and the map has barely moved. Now, I want you to understand something about military momentum. In combat, momentum is not just a metaphor. It is a measurable, tangible force. When an army has it, everything gets easier. Logistics flow, morale holds, enemy forces make mistakes out of panic. When an army loses it, the reverse is true. Every attack costs more. Every gain costs more blood. The friction of war begins to grind the machine down from the inside. Russia had momentum in 2024 and 2025. There were moments, genuinely alarming moments, when Ukrainian defensive lines seemed on the verge of collapse, when the pressure on the energy grid looked like it might bring the country to its knees. Those were real dangers. Anyone who says otherwise wasn't paying attention. But that momentum has now stalled, and when momentum stalls in a war of attrition, the clock starts running against you. What broke Russia's momentum? The answer is not one thing. It never is in war. It is a convergence. The first major fracture point is one that most people outside military and technology circles have not fully processed: the loss of Starlink access. This matters enormously, and not simply for the obvious communications reasons. When Russian forces on the ground lost access to Starlink, they didn't just lose internet connectivity. They lost the nervous system that had been quietly threading their operations together. Drone operators lost the ability to transmit real-time imagery to command posts. Unit commanders lost the seamless coordination they had come to depend on. The fog of war, which every military commander fears above almost everything else, descended again over Russian frontline operations. Decisions slowed, attacks became less coordinated, and in modern warfare, where the margin for error is razor thin, slower decisions mean dead soldiers. But if Starlink's removal was the wound, Ukraine's reconstituted drone superiority is the infection that has turned that wound into something far more serious for the Russian military. And this is where the story becomes extraordinary. Ukraine has reestablished its advantage in the drone war. That sentence sounds simple. its implications are not. Ukrainian strike drones, improved, extended range, increasingly AI-assisted, are now flying 2.5 to 3 times farther than the most common Russian fiber optic drones. That expanded range is not just a technical achievement. It represents a fundamental restructuring of how Ukraine fights. Previously, Ukrainian drone operators focused primarily on targeting Russian troops in the act of assaulting Ukrainian defensive positions, a reactive defensive application of drone technology. Now, Ukrainian strike drones are going deeper. They are hitting Russian frontline logistics. They are targeting concentrations of forces before those forces ever reach the line of contact. They are destroying fuel depots, command posts, and supply chains, the arteries that keep an offensive army alive. The results have been staggering. According to a Russian military blogger, a source with no incentive to exaggerate Ukrainian effectiveness, 8 or 9 out of every 10 Russian casualties are now occurring before Russian soldiers even reach the front line. Read that again and let it settle. Before they reach the front line. Russia is losing its offensive capacity not in the brutal, grinding, close combat exchanges we associate with this war, but in the rear areas, on the approach roads, in the staging grounds. Ukraine has figured out how to stop the attacks before they begin. This is a command and control insight of profound importance. In all my years in special operations, one of the highest value mission types was the interdiction of the enemy's ability to mass and maneuver. You don't wait for the enemy to come to you and then fight him on his terms. You disrupt his logistics, his communications, his ability to concentrate force, and you do it before he ever arrives. Ukraine is now applying this principle at industrial scale with drones. The strategic elegance of it, achieved not by a massive centralized military bureaucracy, but by a scrappy, decentralized industrial ecosystem, deserves serious recognition. And what comes next will challenge everything you think you know about which side holds the technological edge in this war. Ukraine now has more strike drones than Russia. This is not a Ukrainian government boast. This is reported by both Russian and Ukrainian sources. Zelensky's aide, Pavlo Polisa, has stated that Ukraine currently fields 1.3 strike drones for every Russian strike drone. But the numerical advantage is only part of the picture. The more important difference lies in how these two nations produce and innovate their drone fleets. And the contrast reveals something fundamental about organizational culture and its relationship to battlefield effectiveness. Ukrainian drone production is decentralized. Different companies, ranging from large manufacturers to small entrepreneurial workshops, are simultaneously developing and refining new systems based on direct battlefield feedback. When a new drone design proves effective in combat, production scales up rapidly. The feedback loop between the front line and the factory floor is short, responsive, and brutally pragmatic. Nobody sits in a committee for 3 months deciding whether a battlefield lesson is worth incorporating into the next model. The lesson happens on Tuesday, and the revised drone is in production by Friday. Russia's approach is the mirror opposite. Military production in Russia, drone production included, is heavily centralized. Decisions flow from the top down through layers of bureaucracy that prioritize political considerations, establish contracts, and institutional inertia over battlefield adaptability. New designs must navigate approval processes that are, by their nature, slow. Lessons from the front take longer to reach engineers, and by the time a new or improved system enters mass production, the battlefield has often already shifted to the next tactical problem. This is not a new phenomenon in Russian military history. The centralized command structure that enables authoritarian states to mass produce proven systems at enormous scale is the same structure that makes them slow to innovate when the battlefield demands something new. Ukraine, operating with far fewer resources but far more organizational agility, is outpacing Russia in the war's most dynamic domain. The numbers on lethality make this impossible to ignore. Zelensky stated that in March of 2026, drone strikes killed or wounded close to 40,000 Russian soldiers. while artillery and all other strike methods combined accounted for roughly 1,363 casualties. Even if you discount these numbers for the inevitable uncertainty surrounding battlefield casualty claims, even if you cut them in half, the ratio remains breathtaking. Drones are currently approximately 30 times more lethal than artillery in this war. Artillery, which for most of modern military history has been the dominant killer on the conventional battlefield, has been categorically surpassed. This is not an incremental shift in tactics. This is a revolution in the character of land warfare unfolding in real time. The implications for how armies around the world train, equip, and plan must be reckoned with. The lesson of Ukraine in 2026 is that any nation that enters a future conventional conflict without mastery of the unmanned aerial battlefield is not fighting with a disadvantage. It is fighting with one hand tied behind its back and a blindfold on. But the drone story in Ukraine in 2026 is not limited to aerial platforms. Something new is emerging on the ground itself, and it is perhaps the most forward-looking development of this entire conflict. Unmanned ground vehicles, land drones, are now playing a prominent and growing role in Ukrainian operations, not in the experimental sense, not as test concepts, in actual combat. A Ukrainian officer speaking to The Guardian stated that 90% of Ukrainian frontline logistics are now conducted by unmanned ground vehicles. Think about what that means for force preservation. Every supply run to the front line that is conducted by a robot is a Ukrainian soldier who is not killed delivering ammunition. Every mine lane mission completed by an unmanned vehicle is a Ukrainian combat engineer who goes home. The humanitarian logic is as important as the tactical logic. A nation that can sustain its war effort while reducing the attrition of its most irreplaceable resource, its people, holds a structural advantage in any prolonged conflict. And then came the milestone that no one in the history of modern warfare had previously achieved. Ukrainian forces captured a Russian position, an actual fortified position on the front line, through the coordinated action of ground and aerial drones alone, without any infantry involvement. Zelensky announced this achievement, and while the geopolitical world was busy discussing diplomacy and aid packages, this single event quietly announced the arrival of a new era. If it can be done once, it can be refined. If it can be refined, it can be scaled. And if it can be scaled, then the question of how infantry-heavy conventional armies project force must be entirely reconsidered. But if you think the battlefield story is where the real weight of this moment lies, you're not ready for what's coming. Because the battlefield is only one dimension of this war, and the pressures building on the Russian side extend far deeper than any single front line. Let us talk about what is happening inside Russia, in its economy, its recruitment system, and in the increasingly fragile relationship between the Russian government and its own people. Russia entered 2026 having sustained 2 years of what appeared to be steady, if costly, military progress. The Kremlin's calculation was consistent: absorb the losses, maintain pressure, outlast Ukraine's will to fight, and the West's will to fund it. This is a strategy with historical precedent. It has worked for authoritarian states before, and for a time, it appeared to be working again. Russia was recruiting 1,000 soldiers per day in 2025, enough to sustain the offensive while absorbing the casualties, enough to keep the math working, at least on paper. But the math has changed. As of early 2026, according to analysis by economist Janis Kluge at the German Institute for International and Security Affairs, Russian recruitment has dropped to between 800 and 1,000 soldiers per day, a decline of approximately 20% compared with the same period the previous year. This is happening despite the Russian government paying higher recruitment bonuses than ever before, despite the appeals to patriotism, despite the economic incentive for many Russians in impoverished regions where a military salary remains one of the few reliable sources of income. Despite all of it, fewer men are signing up. Why? Because word travels. It travels through the families of the dead. It travels through the veterans who come home broken or don't come home at all. It travels in the quiet, devastating arithmetic of loss that no propaganda apparatus can fully suppress. 8 or 9 casualties before they even reach the front line means the men being recruited are not dying as warriors in battle. They are dying in staging areas, on supply roads, in the moments before they ever see the enemy. That is a particular kind of demoralizing truth, and it is beginning to register in Russia's recruitment numbers. This is not a catastrophic collapse, not yet, but the direction matters as much as the magnitude. If casualties continue to outpace recruitment, and current indicators suggest they will, Putin will face a decision that every authoritarian leader who has stumbled into a grinding war eventually must face: forced mobilization. Another wave of conscription pulled from a population that is already restless, already grieving, already feeling the economic weight of a war that was supposed to be quick and decisive. The political cost of that decision will not be small. And speaking of political cost, Putin's approval ratings, even as measured by Kremlin-linked polling institutions, have entered a period of consecutive weekly decline. In mid-April, one state-affiliated polling organization reported his approval at 65.6%, the 7th consecutive week of decline. In the context of a tightly controlled information environment, where favorable numbers are practically structural features of the political landscape, 7 weeks of consecutive decline is a signal. The Kremlin hears these numbers. They adjust, they worry, and they should. The domestic economic picture compounds everything. Inflation is rising in Russia. There is a meaningful labor shortage, partly because so many men of working age are dead, disabled, or deployed. Enterprises are closing. Wages are going unpaid. According to the Russian newspaper Vedomosti, the number of planned layoffs exceeded 100,000 as of April 1st. Russia's federal budget deficit reached $61 billion in the first quarter of 2026 alone, exceeding the total deficit originally planned for the entire year. The war is consuming resources faster than the Russian economy can generate them, even with elevated energy revenues, even with wartime production prioritization, even with every financial lever the Kremlin can pull. There is a compounding logic to all of this that a military strategist recognizes immediately. Recruitment problems reduce offensive capacity. Reduced offensive capacity means slower territorial gains. Slower gains erode the narrative of inevitable Russian victory that has been the primary tool for sustaining domestic support. Eroded support means declining approval ratings and growing social friction. Growing friction makes mobilization politically riskier. Riskier mobilization means recruitment problems persist and worsen. The wheel turns, and each revolution makes the next one harder. Russia is caught inside this loop right now, and it is not clear how it escapes. The war in 2026 is not going according to the Kremlin's plan. The drone war has turned against them. The recruitment mathematics are moving in the wrong direction. The economy is under severe strain, and the Ukrainian army, battered, stretched, operating with far fewer resources than its opponent, is not collapsing. It is adapting. It is counterattacking. It is forcing Russia to divert forces, alter plans, and absorb losses in areas where it expected easy gains. This is what genuine strategic resilience looks like. Not the absence of suffering, not the absence of losses. Ukraine has suffered enormously. Its losses in tanks, vehicles, aircraft, and, most painfully, in human life, have been severe. But resilience is not the absence of damage. Resilience is the capacity to absorb damage and continue to function, to adapt, and to find new ways to impose cost on the enemy. Ukraine has demonstrated that capacity with extraordinary consistency across more than 4 years of full-scale war. There is a principle I have returned to throughout my career, one that I have seen proven in the mountains of Afghanistan, in the waters of the Persian Gulf, and in every theater of conflict where I have watched men and nations test the limits of their endurance. The principle is this: in a prolonged fight, the side that sustains its partnerships wins. Not always the side with the largest army, not always the side with the most advanced weapons, the side that keeps its allies committed, keeps its supply lines open, and keeps the shared will to fight alive across multiple nations and governments. That side holds a structural advantage that raw military power alone cannot overcome. Ukraine, as of the spring of 2026, is beginning to consolidate exactly that kind of advantage, and the story of how it got there is as important as any development on the battlefield itself. For months, a single man stood as the primary obstacle between Ukraine and a financial lifeline that could reshape the trajectory of the war. Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban had been blocking a 90 billion euro European Union loan to Ukraine, wielding the veto power available to EU member states with the precision of someone who understood exactly how much leverage he held. His obstruction was not military. It required no soldiers, no weapons, no battlefield strategy. It required only the willingness to say no inside a political chamber. And the result was that tens of billions of euros sat frozen, unavailable to a country fighting for its survival. This is how modern great power competition sometimes works. The most consequential battles are not always fought with rifles and artillery. Sometimes they are fought in parliaments and courtrooms and budget negotiations, and the casualties are measured not in lives, but in delayed capability and exhausted opportunity. Then came April. Orban faced a general election against a unified opposition that had made his governance, including his relationship with Moscow and his obstruction of Ukrainian aid, a central issue. He lost, decisively. And within days, his successor's government removed the Hungarian veto. On April 23rd, the president of the European Council announced that the 90 billion euro loan was now available to Ukraine. The dam broke. And what flowed through was not merely money. It was a signal to every actor watching this conflict, in Moscow, in Beijing, in Washington, in every capital calculating the odds, that Europe's commitment to Ukraine was not softening, it was hardening. Now understand the architecture of this loan, because the details matter in ways that go beyond the headline number. Approximately 60 billion euros of the total will be directed not toward general budget support, but specifically toward Ukraine's domestic military-industrial complex. This is not charity. This is strategic investment in sovereign defense production capacity. The distinction is critical. When you give a nation money to buy weapons from your factories, you create dependency. When you give a nation money to build its own factories and produce its own weapons, you create resilience. You create a country that, over time, becomes capable of sustaining its own defense without relying entirely on the goodwill and political continuity of foreign governments. Europe is not just helping Ukraine survive this war. It is, with this allocation, helping Ukraine build the industrial foundation to never again be as vulnerable as it was in February of 2022. The remainder of the loan, roughly 30 billion euros, will be directed toward keeping the Ukrainian economy functional, because a nation at war cannot fight if its economy collapses beneath it. Soldiers need to be paid. Infrastructure needs to function. Civilian morale, which is a military asset as real as any weapon system, requires that the basic structures of daily life continue to operate. Europe understands this. And in the repayment structure of this loan lies one of the most pointed geopolitical statements of the entire conflict. Ukraine will only be required to repay this loan if Russia pays war reparations. The loan is, in its design, a declaration that Europe considers Russia financially liable for this war, and that Ukraine's obligation is contingent on that accountability being realized. That is not just economics. That is a statement of moral and legal principle embedded in a financial instrument. But if you think the 90 billion euro loan is the full measure of Europe's renewed commitment, you are only seeing the surface. Because beneath that headline, in April of 2026, a cascade of military aid announcements followed one after another, with a rhythm and a cumulative weight that cannot be dismissed as symbolic. Sweden announced it would deliver Tridon Mark II air defense systems valued at 400 million euros, specifically targeted at countering the Shahed drone threat that has been one of Russia's most consistent tools for terrorizing Ukrainian cities and degrading civilian infrastructure. This matters because air defense is not a passive capability. Every Russian Shahed drone that is intercepted before it reaches a Ukrainian power grid or apartment building is a unit of civilian suffering that does not occur. It is a portion of Ukrainian civilian morale that is preserved. It is a power plant that keeps running and a hospital that keeps its lights on. Sweden, a nation that for most of its post-war history maintained careful neutrality, is now contributing directly to Ukraine's active defense. The strategic culture of Europe is changing, and it is changing because of what Russia's actions have demonstrated about the nature of the threat. On April 14th alone, a single day, the volume of announced military commitments was remarkable. Germany announced an allocation of 3.2 billion euros to supply several hundred GEMT missiles for Patriot air defense systems. Germany also committed to sending 36 Iris-T air defense systems, one of the most capable short to medium range air defense platforms available, and pledged 300 million euros specifically for long-range weapon production inside Ukraine. And then came the announcement that, from a technological standpoint, may prove to be the most consequential of all. Germany and Ukraine will jointly produce approximately 5,000 AI-based drones. Not purchase, not transfer, jointly produce on Ukrainian soil with Ukrainian engineers, building the next generation of autonomous unmanned systems that will carry artificial intelligence into the war zone. Think about the operational implications of AI-integrated drones at scale. The primary vulnerability of current Ukrainian drone systems, even with their extended range and increasing lethality, is electronic warfare. Russian jamming systems attempt to sever the communication link between drone operators and their aircraft. It is an ongoing contest between the people deploying drones and the people trying to blind them. But AI-operated drones shift the fundamental terms of that contest. A drone that carries its decision-making capacity on board, that can identify targets, navigate terrain, and execute its mission without a continuous communication link to a human operator, is categorically resistant to the jamming that currently disrupts conventional drone operations. You cannot jam a decision that is made inside the drone itself. The Russians will develop countermeasures. They always do. But they will be starting from behind against an adversary that is already scaling production with the support of one of Europe's most formidable engineering and manufacturing cultures. Lithuania, Belgium, Norway, Bulgaria, and Estonia made new contributions to the procurement initiative that channels resources toward purchasing weapons directly from the United States, keeping that supply line active even as American political attention has shifted elsewhere. The Netherlands and Norway together pledged nearly 800 million euros specifically toward Ukrainian drone production. Not air defense, not artillery ammunition, not tanks, but drones. The weapon that has proven 30 times more lethal than artillery in this conflict is now receiving dedicated, substantial European investment aimed directly at Ukrainian production capacity. And then Britain stepped forward with the largest drone package announced by any single nation to Ukraine since the war began, a commitment to deliver at least 120,000 drones in 2026 alone. Long-range drones, reconnaissance drones, logistics drones, the full spectrum of unmanned capability across the operational depth of the battlefield. 120,000 systems in a single year from a single ally. When you add that to Ukraine's own expanding domestic production, to the AI drone joint venture with Germany, to the Netherlands and Norway funding, the picture that emerges is not of a country struggling to sustain itself. It is of a country that is being systematically equipped for a long-term, technologically sophisticated, drone-centric form of warfare that plays directly to its demonstrated comparative advantages.